Welcome back to the Conquest of Happiness. Today we are going into a bonus video on a topic in the pursuit of happiness that I think is so important to underscore and highlight that I felt it warranted a separate video. And that's the topic of an internal versus an external pathway to finding happiness. Alan Watts says the following: books on happiness are generally speaking of two kinds. There are those which tell us how to become happy by changing our circumstances, and those which tell us how to become happy by changing ourselves. And then, if such books are not mere philosophy, both kinds proceed to give advice as to the ways and means in which happiness may be attained, describing a spiritual, psychological, or material technique to achieve the desired result. So again, those are two very different approaches to finding happiness: changing our circumstances or changing ourselves. Every theorist, psychologist, philosopher, researcher in happiness studies will fall somewhere on this spectrum, and that's how I think we should think about it rather than an either or, a spectrum between a very extreme internal pathway to finding happiness all the way to an extreme external pathway to finding happiness. And through this bonus video, we'll learn where Bertrand Russell is situated along this spectrum in his own approach to happiness that we are studying closely. So to put forward a position that is at its most extreme an external pathway to happiness, to make this a little more concrete, because up till this point, it's still rather abstract, an internal versus external pathway to happiness. I found a really great reference, a really great way to convey this in one of Erich Fromm's works. Erich Fromm was a social psychologist, a psychoanalyst, a humanistic philosopher and sociologist who lived in the 20th century, as pretty much all the works I read are situated in like mid-20th century psychology, it seems like. Anyways, Erich Fromm contributed a number of notable ideas to theoretical psychology. And in the work that I've been currently reading called The Art of Loving, that was published in 1956, it was his bestseller in his lifetime, he quotes Freud, or summarizes a Freudian position that I think Freud is going to be our spokesperson for an advocate of the external pathway to happiness in its full ripeness. Erich Fromm summarizes Freud by saying that happiness might be linked to the full and uninhibited satisfaction of all our instinctual desires. Most spiritual traditions are at the other extreme. Most spiritual traditions are going to advocate that pursuing worldly desire, or as Freud says it, pursuing the full and uninhibited satisfaction of all of our instinctual desires is a pathway fraught with suffering and frustration. And traditions like Buddhism, for example, teach the renouncing of worldly desire. That's an extreme internal pathway to happiness. I would say that by default, we naturally orient to the more Freudian view, right? We naturally orient to trying to, live life to the fullest and achieve a lot in our limited time here on Earth. And it seems like for many people, in midlife, especially in what the Jungians call the second half of life, people are because of disillusionment in life, frustration, because life is hard and is more challenging, demanding, and complex than perhaps what we thought when we were imagining possibilities when, say, we were 18 graduating high school. Many of us are thrown back onto the need to search inward for happiness or take a step out of our trajectory. And that's when many of us are undergo a spiritual awakening of sorts, or at least finding spiritual life as a refuge and resource. And by no means are these also at odds. You don't have to choose an internal or external pathway to happiness. You can pursue it along both lines. And I think naturally I would probably advocate for that kind of approach, like put all your eggs in all the baskets, right? Pursue worldly success and worldly life, and pursue also inner ways, changing yourself to help you achieve happiness. So a spokesperson on the spiritual side of things we might draw from is Matthieu Ricard, who I've mentioned before in some of the introductory videos. He's a practicing Buddhist and has a work on happiness. He points out in that work that we neglect the methods and ways of being that cultivate happiness, and he wants to emphasize that as a more direct pathway to happiness. It doesn't cost anything, and a more tried and true method that, if we're depending on anything outside of ourselves, we're bound to be disappointed when those things go away or change. He says on page 33 and 35 of his own work on happiness, called Happiness, A Guide to Developing Life's Most Important Skill, published in 2003, our desires are boundless and our control over the world is limited, temporary, and more often than not illusory. The search for temporary well-being may occasionally be successful. It's never possible, though, to control the quantity, quality, or duration of external circumstances, because Buddhists have a metaphysics of the world as eternal flux or impermanence, as it's sometimes called in some of their teachings. We can't ultimately depend on anything outside of ourselves to carry us completely or sustain us or be there forever or not change. So kind of knowing where those extremes are, Bertrand Russell's recipe for happiness is a blend of both internal and external pathways. I would say he falls more on the side of the external pathway to happiness, actually, and is advocating for a worldly happiness, like how to be happy, in our day-to-day worldly affairs, in our family life, in our working life, in our communities. But he does have a keen eye set on the necessity of working with inner life, specifically expectations, and other habits of mind that get in the way or conversely help build and boost happiness. This appears in what I have called his recipe for happiness in the first introduction video of this series, that we should pursue the good life by trying to get the most out of life to get what we want and fulfill our desires to their limits, to their logical extremes, and then to let go of what is out of our reach, what's unrealistic, what we can't achieve, because we're not limitless in this life. We are situated in a lot of limits in terms of our socioeconomic status, in terms of our innate talents and gifts and the limits of those, in terms of just the sheer fact of how much time we get on this earth. Furthermore, if we're deluded about once we obtain what we're setting out to obtain, that will actually bring us happiness, as is commonly the case, we misery make for ourselves. It's important enough that this sentiment is evoked in another one of Bertrand Russell's premises, which, quote, he says, unhappiness is due largely to mistaken views of the world, or mistaken habits of mind, mistaken ethics, and mistaken habits of life that lead to the destruction of natural zest and appetite upon which happiness depends. I want to highlight that Bertrand Russell's emphasis on habits of mind as culprits of unhappiness and a mechanism by which we can promote happiness is really that internal trend toward cultivating happiness. So again, he's really advocating for an external pathway, but then there's this, emphasis on working with our own, again, expectations and such that might cultivate a richer happiness for ourselves. A more modern day way of saying what Bertrand's trying to convey would be that the culprit of unhappiness often lies in our perception. Thus, the cure would be to change your perception, and that is something that you can tinker with, which is great because that's under your direct influence, that you can change your conditioning, which is sort of all the rage in New Age circles right now. Relatedly, other contemporary psychologists and traditions in psychology support this, that perception is really at play in a lot of our psychology. For example, the cognitive revolution itself, which is known to be the third wave in psychology, that really took hold in the 50s, 60s, and 70s after psychoanalysis, the first wave, and behaviorism, the second wave, really calls to our attention between stimulus and response, which was a behavioral way of looking at human life, right? That we are very deterministic, that there's a filter, a mediating reality, and that's our cognition, the way we think about things. And by focusing our attention on modifying our cognition, we have different outcomes. And this cognitive revolution in psychology, it has influenced and reshaped the entirety of psychology. And though that's not sort of the current focus, I wouldn't say, of 21st century psychology, its influence is immense, and it's really integrated into psychology and psychotherapy in such a way that it's hard to understate its impact. Daniel Gilbert, who is a contemporary researcher in happiness, he has his own work on it, and a lovely TED Talk, by the way. His book is called Stumbling on Happiness. His premise concerns something that relates to perception and the ways that our brain really perceives in distorted ways based on its evolutionary history that can lead us to traps in our subject matter, to traps of unhappiness. It can lead to other illusions, delusions, errors in thinking, biases. But for our subject matter, what Daniel Gilbert's premise will bear upon is the way that the brain's hardwiring and the way that it functions by default can lead us into traps of unhappiness. So his premise in Stumbling on Happiness is that though we are well equipped with a powerful future forecasting brain, it's an anomaly in evolutionary history. We are the only species that can imagine future possibilities to such degrees and at a level of detail unknown in the history of life. Yet, though our brains are extremely powerful, they develop late on the evolutionary scene, so there's a lot of glitches involved in our faculties involved in future forecasting. And one of those glitches is that he really draws a lot of research together to empirically show that we're notoriously prone to what he calls illusions of foresight, and such that we're misguided routinely in our well-intentioned quest after the good life. We're notoriously bad at predicting what makes people actually happy, and we're notoriously bad at actually predicting what would make us happy in an individual sense. This is sort of baked in perception itself, and it takes a lot of cognitive work to kind of penetrate our biases in order to not be swept up by them. For example, he says, when brains plug holes in their conceptualizations of yesterday and tomorrow, when we imagine, when we fantasize, when we remember, we use a material called today. We misremember our past by recalling that what we thought, did, or said is what we now think, do, or say. He says the past is a wall with holes. The future is a hole with no walls. Memory uses what's called the filling in trick. Imagination is the filling in trick. Something related to that would be that he says, present states dominate attention and awareness so much that it makes it difficult to conjure the facts of other states, of other realities. Even though we're equipped with the faculty to do that, our present state, our present environment, our present mood shapes memory and fantasy significantly. For example, a really concrete example, maybe I gleaned from his work, or maybe I thought of it myself, I can't remember, is that when you're full and you go grocery shopping, you actually shop light for the week. This is irrational, but it's really hard to get outside of that state of fullness and logically or rationally buy groceries according to the week's demands rather than your current state. The reason for this, by the way, in the brain is that Dan Gilbert says that the brain is wired in terms of the principle reality first, imagination second. And what that means is that it prioritizes reality and makes it more of an emphasis because I guess the same machinery in the mind, the same neural structures are involved in both sensory processing as well as imagining. So the same cortical areas are used for both purposes. And so if you didn't have that principle, reality first, imagination second, he says, if you were at a red light and you imagined a green one, imagination would take, if it had precedence, you would drive through it. So that reality first is really hardwired adaptively into our brain and really hard to get around in terms of being in this, what I was calling a kind of a sunken in island of the present. There's a lot of teaching right now on being in the present moment. This even appears here in this channel as it's a practice of mindfulness, and it really does help with our happiness to be present. But this is a kind of a trap of being too present focused, not able to extrapolate ourselves from the present. And again, I called it the sunken in island of the present. So one research study, again, to demonstrate this, showed biases in self-reports of happiness. So they must have asked subjects, how happy are you in life? Or if you review the past decade, how happy would you say you've been? And the weather on the day that the survey was given had a statistically significant impact on those self-reports. So again and again, Gilbert is great at demonstrating how we are influenced by these biases, and we confuse reality-based feelings for what we're trying to conjure in imagination, or what he calls pre-feeling. So we need to pursue happiness, be able to set aside our current state, not let it dominate our mind, cloud our thinking, or bias our judgments. That is the task of transforming the primitive instincts, which is a subject matter that I'm really going to dive deeply into in late 2020 and 2021. It's like the thing I want to talk about. But for now, let's just put a bookmark there. Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Happiness Hypothesis, has a formulation of happiness he calls happiness comes from within and happiness comes from without. In his language, he's trying to say that he favors a blend of an internal and external pathway to finding happiness. In his work, you'll find his musings on happiness on page 239 related to this spectrum as happiness is not something that you can find, acquire, or achieve directly. You have to get the conditions right and then wait. Some of those conditions are within you, such as working on how you process life, such as achieving and maintaining coherence among the parts and levels of your personality. Other conditions require relationships to things beyond you. Just as plants need sun, water, and good soil to thrive, people need love, work, and a connection to something larger than themselves. It's worth striving to get the right relationships between yourself and others, between yourself and your work, and between yourself and something larger than yourself. Jonathan Haidt's concept of the history of happiness is wonderful, and he has such concise prose. I really like his writing style. So circling back around to Alan Watts, who began this entire investigation of this spectrum of the internal versus external pathway to happiness, he, in his own work, poses a paradox. He says those who are happy already don't seek it, and those that are seeking it don't find themselves becoming happy. So how do we go about finding happiness with this paradox? He says the paradox is in place because the kind of self-assertive, effortful striving after happiness undermines chances at happiness, such that those who search for happiness never find it, because they're trying to manufacture it by the very means that defeat it, if you can wrap your head around that paradox. He does get out of the paradox with his deep insights into the nature of life by claiming that perhaps the truth is that there is no need to search for happiness. So Alan Watts solves for this spectrum by undercutting it. He actually is the only person I've found, at least, to not be on the spectrum whatsoever. He's like at a collapse point zero underneath the spectrum, and he offers something he calls happiness of the most profound kind. So this happiness of the most profound kind is to be found by accessing he was kind of known for this controversial kind of, we might call it fast-tracked satori, or fast-tracked enlightenment, of which he got a lot of flack in his lifetime for promoting. And he will say, enlightenment, satori, or profound happiness is not something to be acquired, affected, or even cultivated, but something to be realized. It's as close to home, he'll say, as it gets. As this very moment, we have that union and harmony with life that he thinks is responsible for happiness in the Taoist sense of the world, being in the Tao, being in the flow of life, in spite of ourselves. We create problems simply by not being aware that we're already there. And that lack of understanding causes in turn, that lack of understanding causes and is in turn caused by the delusion of self-sufficiency, or the delusion of the ego. It's unusually complicated because in fact it's unusually simple. Its solution lies so close to us and is so self-evident that we have the greatest difficulty in seeing it. To understand such tremendous simplicity, Watts says, one has to open the eyes of the mind and see. I might, bridging researchers, classify Alan Watts's happiness of the most profound kind as a special subset of Martin Seligman's enduring happiness. Martin Seligman is the father of positive psychology, and he has a distinction between momentary happiness and enduring happiness. I want to claim that happiness of the most profound kind is a stable state of enduring happiness. Alan Watts says, beyond the reach of any technique under the sun. The kind that doesn't depend on external events, which belongs to the very nature of the individual and remains unaffected by suffering, persisting through joy and sorrow. This is a spiritual undertone which results from the positive and wholehearted acceptance of life in all of its aspects. If you're interested in this way of acceptance that Alan Watts talks about and teaches, he distinguishes between partial and total acceptance. To achieve total acceptance is the foundation upon which happiness of the most profound kind is based. If you're interested in this, I am going to consider making another video exclusively on Alan Watts's way of acceptance. Please let me know in the comments below if you would be interested in seeing that, and I'll compile some notes on such. It is delicious, it's profound, not to mention profoundly useful. A teaching closely related to Marsha Linehan's idea of radical acceptance. Tara Brach also has a book by the same name. Marsha Linehan teaches Dialectical Behavioral Therapy that I also teach here at Center for Higher Consciousness. So let me know if you'd like to see that, and I will see you all soon.